But the problem is there is this danger zone in the short term because as China's economic rise ends, which we think it is for a number of reasons, we think the economy is not going to recover. China is going to basically be locked into very sluggish or 0% growth going forward for a number of reasons we can get into. As that economic rise slows, China has fewer carrots to kind of buy off opposition, to advance its geopolitical interests, to woo the Taiwanese back, et cetera. And so China is increasingly going to do what past peaking powers did, like Germany, Japan, where they turn to military tactics to try to coerce other countries to give them what they want. And so we're worried that as China's economic rise slows, it's going to increasingly turn to military solutions over something like Taiwan or the South China Sea. And we see the 2020s as this critical danger zone because the United States, Taiwan, other allies in East Asia have been very slow to build up their military forces, whereas China is engaged in the largest peacetime military buildup of any country since Nazi Germany.
Trump leaves China guessing what his next move is with unusual inauguration invitation. President-elect Donald Trump has recently extended an invitation to President Xi of China to join him at his January 20th inauguration. Now, no formal agreement has been reached yet, and it's unclear whether or not Xi will actually accept this invitation. This comes amidst heightened geopolitical tensions between the two countries as Trump has threatened more tariffs on China and China has threatened to retaliate. So what is Trump's next move with China and how will China respond to this next move? We'll find out with our next guest, Michael Beckley. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and co-author of the book Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China. He is also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We'll also be talking about China's economic slowdown as recent data suggests that the economy is slowing down, probably even more than anticipated. Michael, it's good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Good to see you too, David. Thanks for having me on.
Michael, let's start with some recent news coming out of China. Higher levels of social unrest. Take a look at my screen at this headline in particular. China races to squelch unrest as signs of economic malaise spread. Faced with rising social frustrations and public unrest, China's leaders are ramping up security measures and squelching discordant views on the country's economic health. A spate of deadly attacks in China in recent weeks, including mass stabbings and car ramming incidents, has unnerved officials and ordinary people alike. So people are waking up to the fact, or protesting the fact that the economy is not doing as well as it once was. Some data coming out of China, retail sales growth in China slowed unexpectedly sharply in November, rising just 3% year over year compared with October's 4.8% gain. Investment in buildings, equipment, and other fixed assets also slowed. Now, if you look at youth unemployment, it's been high all year round, reaching up to 20% at some point and staying above 17%. So the economic slowdown that we're seeing is not really new. Of course, there have been reports of deflation in China and some sectors as well. But anything that has changed recently that has sparked this uptick in mass social unrest?
I think it's the compounding effects of a perception that both the economy is doing poorly, so people's lives are just getting worse. That's where you see that in public opinion polls, where for the first time in generations, more and more Chinese people are saying that their lives are literally getting worse every single year. And so it's the wealthy who are losing investment opportunities and losing just frankly big parts of their nest eggs in all of these losses going on across the property sector. You have middle class people who have sunk their life savings into apartments that are half built and they're not going to get that money back. You have poor workers who basically are out of a job and have to go find jobs in the informal sector. And so there's this pent up aggression combined with, I think, an increasing belief that the Chinese regime doesn't really know what it's doing. And you see this really uptick after the zero COVID lockdowns where people said, what was that? You kept us locked down in our apartments for 2 years almost on end. And then you just threw the doors open and, what, a million, maybe more than a million people died because of that sudden reopening. So I think it's the combination of economic tough times with just hey, this regime doesn't really seem to have any fresh ideas about how to turn our lives around.
What needs to be done to make the average Chinese citizens' lives better, you think?
Well, I think Chinese people will often tell you the Chinese government is rich, but the Chinese people are poor, and that's by design. So if you're a Chinese citizen, there's relatively few options of what you can do with your money. You can put it in a state-owned bank, which is what most people do, where the rate of interest you're paid is below returns that you can get anywhere else pretty much in the world. So you're losing money on your savings, or you can play around on the real estate market, which we've seen is a giant bubble, or go onto the Chinese stock market, which a lot of people think is rigged in favor of elites. And so the fundamental problem is the Chinese system basically obligates China's citizens to give the government low or below market rate interest loans. So they just have this huge stash of cash, which they then use to subsidize all of these heavy industries. That works great for the Chinese Communist Party to maintain their monopoly on power, their patronage system to pay various people off to invest in strategic industries. Mm-hmm. But it means that the Chinese people's disposable wealth is a lot less than what it would be. So you need to transfer wealth back from the government and state-owned enterprises to Chinese households, both by giving them other options with what to do with their money, more social programs, a social safety net. But that means you're basically taking money from elites and having to transfer it to the people. And obviously, there's a lot of vested interests within the party that are staunchly against that kind of reform.
Yes, but I've heard that there's a new wave of Chinese citizens coming online to consume, a new generation, should we say. Now, this new generation has a higher propensity to spend than perhaps the last generation. Perhaps there's more family wealth, and perhaps there are more ideals from Western influences, shall we say, of how they should consume. Wouldn't that prop up the economy?
You might think so, but for one thing, the population is already starting to shrink. So there are just less and less people. Over the next 10 years, China is going to lose at least 70 million working age adults. So that's just 70 million fewer top line consumers that you're going to have. It's just really hard to make up for those kind of population losses with some kind of cultural change. But again, I think the zero COVID lockdowns were a major turning point, because who wants to now go out and spend a lot of money when it just seems like your economic life is so much more precarious than it was before? And with the top line growth rate going down, it just means that there are fewer investment opportunities for your money and a fewer ideas about, hey, maybe our lives will get better. So less security going forward. And so it doesn't, if you just look at consumption statistics, consumption is still abysmally low for a country of middle income status like China. And so even if you have people that thought they would have a life where they'd be able to spend more freely on things like apartments, cars, everything else, now because of the insecurity, the relative lack of a social safety net, you have a lot of people paring back. And it's actually been the regime trying to jumpstart consumption and failing time again, in part because the Chinese people, their disposable incomes are so much lower than the per capita income should be in a country as rich as China.
You notice I'm using Ground News today, which is a very good aggregator for that, sources, articles, and news sources from across the internet. I don't have to waste time anymore Googling individual stories that I need every day. I have everything I need in one place. Easy to find, cohesive, and easy to use website, which is Ground News. It has several very important and unique features, like a bias distribution meter, which shows you what percentage of the articles covering a story are left-leaning, center-leaning, and or right-leaning on the political spectrum. It has an ownership meter, which shows you what percentage of the stories and articles are owned by conglomerates and or independent media sources. So if you use my link, groundnews.com/David Lin, in the link down below, or scan my QR code, you'll get a Vantage plan for half off at just $5 a month. Get started today. Well, let's talk about the trade war now. So Donald Trump has vowed to implement higher tariffs. This came in recently. He said on Truth Social that I have had many talks with China about the massive amounts of drugs, in particular fentanyl, being sent into the United States, but to no avail. Representatives of China told me that they would institute their maximum penalty, that of death, for any drug dealers caught doing this. But unfortunately, they never followed through, and drugs are pouring into our country, mostly through Mexico, at levels never before seen. Until such time they stop, until such time as they stop, we will be charging China an additional 10% tariff above any additional tariff. So I think it's a 10% tariff on top of whatever they have already. What's your reaction to this? And we'll talk about how China is likely to respond.
Well, I think 10% is probably the low level. I expect to see even higher tariffs as things evolve between the Trump administration and China, because it's not just about the fentanyl issue. It's about the massive subsidies that China has given its industries, especially in cutting edge industries, electric vehicles, solar panels, computer chips, direct competitors to American industries. And Trump obviously is sort of an economic warrior. He really pays attention to the trade balance. He pays attention to strategic industries. So I see this 10% as him almost feeling like he's giving China a break, because some people in his administration are talking about 60% tariffs almost across the board on Chinese goods. So what I think is going to happen is he's open to a deal, but I think he wants a deal on his terms, which basically means China would have to fundamentally change its economic model and really scale back a lot of those industrial subsidies, scale back on IP theft, and basically also acknowledge US primacy in East Asia more broadly, its military and diplomatic primacy. And I don't think Xi Jinping has any intention of doing any of that. So I think 10% is what the Trump administration is going to lead with. And then the natural competitive interplay between the United States and China going forward, with both sides dialing up the hawkishness. I expect those rates to go up over the first year of the Trump administration.
China has already banned exports of certain critical minerals, including germanium, antimony. Antimony is used for the production of ammunition. I wonder whether or not critical minerals will be their play for the retaliation.
That's one of their main cards they have to play, because the United States and its allies are just so, still to this day, incredibly dependent on Chinese refining and production of those, even though they could technically mine them themselves from their own domestic stores. I think if you talk to people at the Pentagon, there's a big push to try to diversify away from China, to try to drive up domestic production of a lot of these. But as it stands, China still is the major producer, and that's their major retaliatory card to play against the, for example, the semiconductor restrictions that the United States has put on China. My understanding is that the Trump administration is going to expand what the Biden administration called a small yard and a high fence. You know, just a few strategic industries that we're going to protect. Everything else will stay on the white list. We're already seeing indications that the Trump administration plans to broaden those to cover areas like synthetic biology, artificial intelligence more generally, not just the computer chips that you need for AI. So I see this again. This is a trade war. This is a trade and tech war. You see retaliatory measures being taken in response to retaliatory measures that were taken earlier. This is just the natural dynamic of these kind of competitive situations.
So how does this trade war come back to us, the consumer, the regular person?
Yeah. So on the one hand, imports from China are, maybe 1% to 2% of the U.S. economy at most. And frankly, there's, for the vast majority of goods, you could find other sellers. So it's not like the United States, other than a few of these key areas, like some of these strategic minerals and resources. I don't think the U.S. is going to be held hostage by this, but you are going to see higher prices for consumers, especially in electronics and tech, because a lot of the rudimentary stuff, or just the final assembly of a lot of products, for whether it's laptops, cell phones, et cetera, is still dominantly done in China. Also, things like textiles, obviously, you're going to see higher prices. And then I think there's going to be inflationary effects just by driving up the price of this manufacturing juggernaut in China and the goods that it sells. Now, on the flip side, you will see some increased tax revenue. You obviously have the import protection for American industries and the broader national security benefits of trying to decouple from certain industries in China, but certainly from just what am I paying every day when I go down to the local, Best Buy to go get certain electronics. I think those prices will generally rise precisely because you're taxing the major producer of a lot of these things.
Okay, so if China gets a higher tariff and they retaliate with tariffs of their own on certain industries, or perhaps bans on critical minerals or other things, the question remains as to whether or not China will suffer more from this trade war than the U.S. Who do you think is going to come out on top the second time?
Well, I think if it just stayed a trade war, China would certainly suffer more, because China depends much more on the American market, which is the size of China's plus the Eurozone's combined. It's the dominant market in the world. Whereas China has already been engaged in decoupling and trying to wall off its market from Western competition for more than a decade at this point. And so the relative losses going forward in terms of market share is going to be much greater on the Chinese side of the ledger. The problem is, I don't think the Chinese are very clear that they don't see a trade war as just a purely economic issue. They see it as an assault on China's comprehensive national power, and they're more than willing to do other things. I mean, they're seeding malware in American critical infrastructure for cyber attacks. They're engaging in political meddling in Western elections, and they're obviously driving up their military power in East Asia. So China has many other cards to play. In addition, if you look at their economic documents, they talk about trying to dominate what they call choke points in the global economy. So we may not be able to be dominant across the board. We may lose market share in critical industries, but if we can dominate the production of things like rare earths or medical PPE or run-of-the-mill computer chips, or access to finance, or even access to the South China Sea, then we can use that as leverage in future trade negotiations, even if we are losing more from the loss of market access because of the across the board tariffs that everyone is putting in place. So I think the Chinese still have a lot of cards to play, even though I think they're going to lose a lot more if it's just a question of everyone raising tariffs on each other.
Tell us about some of the themes from your book. It's called Danger Zone: The Coming Conflict with China. Can you elaborate on the economic side of your research? How will China's relationship with the U.S. progress in the future in terms of trade and foreign policy?
Yeah, so the book is co-authored with one of the most eminent historians in geopolitics, Hal Brands, who's at Johns Hopkins University. And the book is basically a new take on the standard "let's all freak out about China" genre of books, except that I think the previous perception was that U.S.-China competition was going to be this marathon that was going to last many years, many decades going forward. We actually think that in the long run, the United States has incredible advantages, economic and ultimately in terms of diplomacy, allies, and military power. But the problem is there is this danger zone in the short term because as China's economic rise ends, which we think it is for a number of reasons, we think the economy is not going to recover. China is going to basically be locked into very sluggish or 0% growth going forward for a number of reasons we can get into. As that economic rise slows, China has fewer carrots to kind of buy off opposition, to advance its geopolitical interests, to woo the Taiwanese back, et cetera. And so China is increasingly going to do what past peaking powers did, like Germany, Japan, where they turn to military tactics to try to coerce other countries to give them what they want. And so we're worried that as China's economic rise slows, it's going to increasingly turn to military solutions over something like Taiwan or the South China Sea. And we see the 2020s as this critical danger zone because the United States, Taiwan, other allies in East Asia have been very slow to build up their military forces, whereas China is engaged in the largest peacetime military buildup of any country since Nazi Germany. It's churning out warships and ammunition at 5 to 6 times the American rate right now. And so there's this imbalance of China looking ahead to a potentially dark economic future, but perhaps feeling like the local military balance is currently favorable and that it needs to seize on those advantages before that window of opportunity closes. This is the same kind of logic that drove Japan to Pearl Harbor. It's the same kind of logic that drove Germany to World War I. And we just worry that China is inching its way down this very well-trodden, ugly historical path.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Soviet Union spent a larger portion of their GDP on defense than the U.S. did, and ultimately their economy couldn't handle it. I'm not saying that's the case right now. Certainly, the U.S. is spending a larger portion of their economy on defense than any other country currently. But could China continue sustainably this military expansion?
I don't think so. I mean, I think for maybe a decade, you can always tighten the belt. I mean, if you look at North Korea as a super extreme example, this is a country that has no economy to speak of, and yet it's able to, in particular areas, amass military forces that can threaten even the United States. So China could really tighten its belt and continue to increase its defense budget. And you already see, I think China's economy is probably growing somewhere between 0 to 2% right now. The military budget's growing by 7 to 10% a year. And I think China could sustain that for at least another decade. So, I think in the long run, you're right to bring up the sort of Soviet style imperial overstretch, over militarized example of a country that just runs out of steam and bankrupts itself. But I think China has a fair amount of runway left in that respect.
Well, you mentioned that they are militarizing for a reason. What really is that reason? Is there a need to use military action to obtain their objectives in the South China Sea with Taiwan, with the Philippines, for example?
Well, I think first and foremost is Taiwan. The fundamental problem for China is that its previous strategy, which was to use peaceful means and basically economic manifest destiny, like just let's forge as many economic links between us and Taiwan as possible, and they'll eventually just want to come back to the mainland. They'll have no choice because they'll just be so economically dependent on us. That strategy has clearly failed because if you look at opinion polls in Taiwan, more and more Taiwanese, the majority of the country now views themselves as solely Taiwanese and not as Chinese. And basically, no one wants to consider peaceful reunification or unification with the mainland. And so, if you're Xi Jinping and you've made bringing Taiwan back into the fold as one of the capstone achievements that you want to see on your watch. It just looks like the Taiwanese are drifting ever further. Meanwhile, their international stature is growing. Their relationship with the United States seems to be getting more solid. You had President Biden saying at least 5 times that the United States would prevent a Chinese takeover and use military force to do so. So you just see the Taiwanese drifting away. And yet you currently have this military advantage because you've spent so much time building up the forces for potential assault on Taiwan. That's why we're so worried about this current period where the US and Taiwan are militarily vulnerable, but diplomatically hostile to Beijing, and giving it the impression that Taiwan is going to drift away and the US will help Taiwan drift away by changing its diplomatic status, either vis-a-vis the US or just recognizing it. Some people in the United States want to just recognize Taiwan as a country. So you can see Taiwan approaching some of these red lines, and Xi Jinping does not give the impression that he wants to go down in history as this transitional figure that presided over the permanent loss of what they regard as their territory.
Okay, well, what's China waiting for then when it comes to Taiwan? If they want to reunify and they have the means to do so, why not invade tomorrow? What's the barrier here?
I think a couple of things. We've seen some recent reports suggesting that all is not well with China's military. So Xi Jinping has purged a number of extremely senior officials and military leaders from the People's Liberation Army, and that suggests to me that he's not impressed with the progress that that organization has made. When he first came into power, he had a very negative view of the military, saw it as bloated and corrupt and needed to be streamlined. He cut the ranks by more than 300,000 people, basically, when he came in. And so he's said that by 2027, he wants to have a military that could theoretically conquer Taiwan. And I think he's waiting to make sure that his military feels ready to go before he rolls the iron dice. I think he was also just waiting to see what happens. You had Russia invade Ukraine. You had the Americans seemingly ready to tear themselves apart with this election that just happened in 2024. So, he was probably hoping for a contested election and the Americans not even knowing who the commander in chief was. And there was also this other strategy that the Chinese are employing of political warfare, trying to meddle in Taiwan's politics. I think this is failing, and it's becoming very clear that it is going to fail for China. But at least for the last year or so, I think there was hope that they could try to sway the Taiwanese elections that happened earlier this year, the American elections, and hopefully get some kind of diplomatic solution so that they don't have to invade. I think that's all going away. And now it's just a question of, is our military up to snuff? Can we do it? And he said 2027 is the year that he wants the military to be at least capable of doing this. So he seems to be planning at least somewhat around that.
2027, you said?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not a fast timeline. I don't think any permanent decisions have been made, but he has said that by 2027, the PLA should be theoretically capable of assaulting Taiwan.
Several high-ranking American officials have also given a similar timeline, although I've heard the counter argument that, it's in the best interest of the American military officials or, people within the military industrial complex to give really bold timelines and predictions for their own self-interest, and it's not it's not really accurate because they have an incentive to promote this kind of propaganda, if you will, and fearmonger the population so they can get more money basically for defense.
There's always going to be warmongers who are going to look to profit from defense spending. I would say a couple of things though. One is, if you look at the level of U.S. defense spending as a share of the economy, it's at 3% or maybe even a little bit below that, like 2.9 or 2.8%. That's on par with what the U.S. was spending in the 1990s when a lot of people said, hey, we just won the Cold War, let's reap a big peace dividend. I mean, in the Cold War, the U.S. spent 6 to 10% of its GDP on defense. And so what we're spending now is 1990s or 1930s level of defense spending relative to the economy. I think also while there certainly are warmongers who just want to spend more on defense, I think there's also people who are just legitimately concerned about what they're seeing coming out of China. I mean, China just did yet another dress rehearsal for a blockade of Taiwan a week or two ago. And so, China is certainly giving signs that this could actually happen. And I think after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which sort of reminded people that when a dictator says this thing that is not a country belongs to us and we will ultimately take it one way or another, that we need to take them seriously, that conquest still can happen in the international system. So I think while there are certainly illegitimate reasons to try to scare up people, I do think that there is a rising security threat that has to be taken seriously. And the U.S. defense industrial base is not up to snuff. I mean, a lot of these war games show that the American forces would run out of missiles after the first week or two of high intensity combat if there is a major war with China. That's just not good enough. And you've seen the strain that's already been put on the U.S. defense industrial base just by just trying to supply the Ukrainians in a regional war. This would be on a much grander scale. And so I think there are legitimate reasons to say, hey, there are certain areas that have to be stepped up because we've put off air and naval modernization off for years and years because the U.S. got so bogged down in counterterrorism operations for the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now we're really paying the pain for having flushed some of our resources down in these forever wars in the Middle East. And now we're facing security threats across Eurasia.
Well, 2027 is within Trump's second term. If China were to make a military maneuver on Taiwan during that time, what would likely be Trump's response? Keep in mind that if Trump were to abandon any sort of military pledge to Taiwan, it would automatically absolve the U.S. from any conflict directly with China.
Yeah, that's a major benefit. And I can't rule out a scenario where if China blockades Taiwan, let's say, and it comes to Trump's desk, what are we going to do? Are we going to send American forces in to break that blockade and fire on Chinese ships? I could see Trump saying, you know what, even though I've been very hawkish on China, I've had a lot of bravado in peacetime. I don't want to be the guy that starts World War III potentially over something like Taiwan. And I could see him balking at the last moment and basically just, writing off the Taiwanese. However, what I worry about is that the United States may not have a choice because I actually think the Chinese assume the Americans are going to get involved and may actually strike American forces early in a conflict to try to gain tactical advantage because they realize that the United States only has 2 military bases within 500 miles of Taiwan that are fully up and running and have big forces on them. Those are both on Okinawa, Japan. If you can knock those out, the Americans are basically fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and you may be able to have your way with Taiwan and do a fait accompli. And I know that I've read Chinese war plans that call for massive strikes on those bases as well as the big base on Guam. And so if the Chinese are convinced, because, for example, President Biden said 5 times the United States would definitely intervene. And because the Pentagon has been gearing up for this fight for a long time, and because 80-something% of Americans already have a negative opinion of the Chinese, and because the Chinese Communist Party has a very long history of being very paranoid about hostility from the United States, even in the heyday of engagement in the 1990s, we have all these documents that have leaked out where top Chinese leaders are basically saying the Americans want to destroy us. I just worry that they're going to assume the Americans will intervene anyway. And so we might as well hit them hard to gain the tactical advantage. And so Trump's decision may not be, do we intervene against a Taiwanese blockade of Taiwan? It's how do we respond to the fact that China just took out 2 of our major military bases and killed hundreds, if not thousands, of American military personnel?
Well, let's just talk about Taiwan for just a minute. So Biden has said, while he was in office, that if China were to attack Taiwan, America would provide direct military assistance. They're not legally bound to do so, but that's what he said. Trump could, of course, say the exact opposite. But is there a strategic advantage for the U.S. to provide direct military support and or provide an alliance at this point?
So if you're asking about should the U.S. upgrade its alliance system, like right now, the U.S. by law has to maintain its own capacity.
Is there any need for the U.S. to protect Taiwan is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think the geopolitical argument is that Taiwan is this unsinkable aircraft carrier at the epicenter of the East and South China Seas, where something like half of world trade flows through. And that is at the epicenter of where the Pacific Ocean meets the Indian Ocean. It's like probably the pound for pound, the most geopolitically important place in the world. And if China is able to just absorb it, especially without firing a shot, and then can unleash its massive military machine elsewhere, a lot of people think, and I tend to agree, that China's expansionist objectives don't end in Taiwan. They may begin in Taiwan. And you've had Xi Jinping already talking about the Ryukyu Islands that Japan currently controls and giving new names for those that are more resonant with his vision of Chinese history there. So I think it's not out of the question that China would use it as a launching pad to start expanding its power, because frankly, that's just what great powers tend to do. I think you briefly mentioned this earlier. You also have to consider the knock-on effects that if the U.S. just abandons Taiwan, how are American allies going to feel about security commitments? Does Japan not develop a nuclear weapon? I'm not so sure that they do.
Yeah.
Do the South Koreans stay non-nuclear? I mean, there are going to be ripple effects, in other words, to a Chinese conquest of Taiwan that I think just make for a more conflictual world. So you should factor that in. I would also just stress the ideological component, though. I mean, Taiwan is the only Chinese democracy out there. And if it just gets crushed by the Chinese Communist Party, that's also not a great look for the idea of democratic governments around the world if the world's most powerful democracy literally doesn't lift a finger in defense of that. So I think you have to consider the sort of moral and diplomatic dimensions. That said, I'm very sympathetic to people that say, you know what, what's worse than all that? World War III is worse than all of that. So we should really reconsider whether we should defend Taiwan. I totally get that argument.
Final point on Taiwan. I'm going to circle back to the economy of China. So the last possibility is, of course, there may be possibly down the line a referendum whereby the Taiwanese people just vote to whether or not to reunify with China. That could be a possibility, a peaceful reunification from the Taiwanese side. How likely is that?
According to opinion polls, I think it's like 3 to 5% of people on Taiwan say that they approve of unification. So I don't think that would pass muster in a referendum. And the young generation is especially against that, especially after seeing Hong Kong and what that gives you a good picture of what one country, two systems actually means in practice. It basically means you bend the knee to Beijing and you become another Chinese province.
You mentioned China's imperialistic ambitions. I wonder where you've come to that conclusion, or how you've come to that conclusion, given that officially, of course, openly with the world, their 14th five-year plan in it has nowhere in it does it say anything about expansion of either political influence or military influence. They focus on economic development domestically, environmental sustainability is on there, social development, agriculture modernization, but not taking over the world.
Well, I mean, first we just talked about Taiwan. Xi Jinping has said repeatedly that bringing Taiwan into the fold is an inevitable requirement of the great rejuvenation of the Taiwanese of the Chinese nation. So Taiwan would be reabsorbed. The South China Sea, too. I mean, the New York Times just recently produced this amazing set of heat maps where they showed Chinese military and paramilitary activity in the South China Sea, and you just see it getting denser and denser and denser every year. And they obviously built 7 artificial islands there. And when you're approached, if you're on a foreign vessel and you get approached by one of these maritime militia vessels from Beijing, they say you are on Chinese territory and you need to get out. So I mean, they're making very clear that the South China Sea is not international waters, that it's Chinese territorial waters. And this is happening on a routine basis right now. So, I think you combine that with there are other internal speeches that Xi Jinping has said where these are territories that were unjustifiably ripped away from China during the century of humiliation. And we need to make China great again, basically, and rejuvenate the Chinese nation by bringing them back under our direct control. I take them at their word. I think it's the same thing that we saw with Russia, where we didn't believe Putin saying that Ukraine is not a nation, and here we are. I think we should just listen to what the Chinese are saying, and you can also see what they're doing in the South China Sea as a leading indicator of what they might do if people stop standing up to that kind of expansion.
Yeah, they have poked the bear, so to speak, in the South China Sea with some military exercises or higher frequency of military exercise. But are these just bluffs? Are these ultimately, can we take these threats seriously? Here's an op-ed you wrote for the New York Times, and I'm just going to highlight this one particular graph that you used. It's showing the economic growth of China over the last 30 years or so, reported by China in the red line, estimated by the Conference Board in the green line, and then estimated by the Rhodium Group in the yellow line. All three sources, however, point to slower economic growth. Now, one could argue it's just a factor of a maturing economy, but the question remains as to whether or not China could even afford these imperialistic expansions that you were talking about.
I think in the long run, it's going to be very hard for China to sustain the levels of military spending it's doing. But I do think there is probably at least a decade, because the regime, that's one benefit of being an autocratic regime, is you can make these decisions by fiat, and you can just say, we're going to spend less on X, Y, or Z at home in order to keep financing the military objectives. We've seen that time and again from autocratic powers. And, I would also just stress that China already de facto controls a lot of what is going on, say in the South China Sea. And it's not just military exercises. There's been a lot of news reports showing you can actually watch on YouTube of Chinese vessels blasting, say, Filipino or Vietnamese ships with water cannons and basically trying to submerge them under the water, or boarding Filipino vessels literally with knives drawn to threaten them to get them out of the area, or blinding them, or ramming their ships to try to sink them. So it's not just statements. If it was just statements, I might say this is a bluff. It's a coercive tool to try to get countries to back down. But they are now just kind of shaping and shoving their way in the South China Sea. And you're seeing something similar happen on the border with India, where you've probably read about those high profile clashes between Chinese and Indian forces in the Himalayas. In some cases, they were just beating each other to death with sticks with nails in them. And so you just see a China that is more willing to push the envelope a bit more when it comes to using force short of war. And I worry that the trend lines are moving towards greater and greater uses of force.
Well, the other side of the argument is that there could be a possibility that China is simply responding to American aggression and American imperialistic endeavors, keeping in mind that Philippines, for example, you brought up the Philippines, an ally of the U.S. Taiwan has military bases of the U.S. on the island. President Obama has made the military shift while he was in power to contain China, shift his priorities of the U.S. military and Navy to the Pacific instead of other theaters. So to what extent is China simply responding to American aggression is my question.
So I think if I were sitting there in Beijing and I'm looking at this chain of American alliances from Japan to South Korea to Taiwan to the Philippines down to Australia, I too would be very concerned. And so I get the Chinese impulse of we need to push American forces back to create a security perimeter for ourselves. We're in a very rough neighborhood. We have a very ugly history in terms of dealing with Western imperial power. So I get that Chinese perspective. But what I would say on the flip side is, the United States is in Japan because the Japanese government has invited the United States to be there. Same thing in the Philippines. There aren't, as far as I know, American military bases on Taiwan, although there are some special operations forces doing some training missions there. So I get that.
You're right. I misspoke. I think, I meant in the past, but you're right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. In the past, there were American nuclear weapons on Taiwan in the 1950s. So yeah, there's a history here. In the South China Sea, the United States just says these are international waters. And so that's where I would strongly disagree with the perspective you just gave, because China seems to be the one, if you just look at its claims compared to every other country puts like a 200 nautical mile zone just off their coastline. China, through the so-called 9 or 10 dash line, just claims like 80 to 90% of the sea as Chinese waters. And as I've pointed out, when you are confronted with a Chinese vessel, they will say, this is Chinese territory. You have to leave. And so that's very different than what the United States is doing in the South China Sea. And so I think you could argue the United States can be heavy-handed. It's hegemonic. It obviously has these big military forces in China's, what it regards as its backyard, but it's not like taking over the sea and saying this belongs to the United States. Yeah. It's saying these are international waters that everyone should be allowed to, including China. And it's the Chinese who are saying this is Chinese territory.
So going back to the Chinese economic growth here, I'll leave this chart up on the screen. What is your longer term outlook for Chinese economic growth? Are we expecting the same level of growth as a developed country like the U.S., nearing 3% GDP, real GDP growth, or is China's equilibrium growth rate going to be higher?
I actually think it's going to be lower. I think China's facing at least one lost decade, if not two, of essentially near 0% economic growth, like just for multiple reasons. Like one is just the demographics. I mentioned earlier, China over the next 10 years is going to lose 70 million working age adults. And at the same time, it's going to gain about 130 million senior citizens. And then it just gets worse from there on out. And so China is unfortunately going to really hit this wall because of things like the one-child policy, the decline in the fertility rate. You just can't grow your economy when your population is collapsing. But current projections suggest China's population is going to collapse in half sometime probably in the 2070s, if not sooner. And so it's just really hard to make up for that kind of loss of workers, taxpayers, and consumers. There's a bunch of other reasons. I mean, the fact that China is starting to lose its economic access to big, rich Western markets like the United States with this trade and tariff war. The Europeans are to some extent following suit, the Japanese. You also just have the fact that China's plowed through a lot of its natural resources. And so raw material prices are really increasing. So there's a number of headwinds that I only see getting worse for China growing forward. And it's just hard to see how it could be overcome given how daunting they are.
Just in the population front, you're right. It is projected that the population of China will contract considerably over the next few decades. But does China need its current level of population to sustain growth? Could productivity not be caught up in other ways with AI or machinery, for example, or advanced technology? And also, I've heard there's a surplus of workers, especially in the countryside right now, as a lot of people don't want to work in some of the factory jobs currently offered.
Well, I think China's fundamental problem is demand.
Mm-hmm.
It's consumers, it's consumption. So you could use robots to replace workers, but robots don't buy anything. And so who's going to buy Chinese products? And that this is where it compounds with the trade protectionism that's going on. Because I think China was hoping we can sell to the Americans, we can sell to the Europeans, and we can use the Belt and Road Initiative to try to create new large markets across the developing world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which is going to account for like half the world's population by the 2050s. The problem is what we're seeing is a lot of those Belt and Road investments are now leading to debt distress, and a lot of those countries are just too poor, even though they have big populations. They have very small markets because there's just not a lot of consumption. So China, you're right. China can make up for some of the loss of production with things like automation. But I think China's fundamental problem is a lack of domestic demand because the Chinese people have low disposable incomes, because the population is shrinking, and because the rest of the world is starting to put up more trade and investment barriers on China. So that poses problems for their economic model, which is very much built around subsidizing massive output of manufactured goods.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have markets to sell them to, you're not going to make any money, and that's why we're seeing why productivity in China has been negative. Productivity growth has been negative for more than a decade. It's just the amount of inputs they have to put in to make a buck is just rising year by year because it's harder to find buyers.
So here you have an interesting chart. China has been one of the world's largest lenders to emerging markets. So going forward, then, what is the relationship between China and emerging markets on the trade front? We know that, as your graph shows, they've been involved in financing. They've also been involved in supporting a lot of infrastructure developments in Africa, for example. So perhaps frontier markets will be, as they mature in the coming decades, will be a new source of income for Chinese manufacturers. Yes or no?
It could be, and I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis. There will be some success cases. There will be some horrible failures, and I think China is just hoping that they've done enough to invest in the infrastructure to really prop up a lot of these markets so that it's sustainable growth opportunities for Chinese companies. But I think, I'm seeing shocking statistics, and I think this is not just a problem for China, by the way. This is a problem for all of us. Shocking statistics showing that, the majority of these developing countries, they are already in debt distress, and it's hard to see how it gets any better. And there just aren't growth opportunities for them because manufacturing has been commodified because of manufacturing. They can't follow the East Asian model of let's invest in export driven industries and manufacturing, because now the returns on those manufacturing industries are very low, and it's already been taken over by incumbents in China as well as in the rich world. So I really worry. The UN just showed that 3.3 billion people, like basically almost half the global population, now lives in a developing country that is paying more on its interest payments on its debt, a lot of which is owed to China, than they are on things like healthcare or education or infrastructure spending. So that's going to put them in a very difficult situation. And for China, because China is one of the major lenders here, a lot of these countries are going to be pointing the finger at China and saying, "Yeah, we're not going to pay these things back, and you should be giving us debt relief." And so that's a big change from 10 years ago when China was dispersing those loans, and everyone loved China because it was easy money, and right. They don't have the World Bank kind of restrictions on it. But now that those loans are coming due, China is now the largest debt collector in the world. Debt collection is a very nasty business. We saw what happened during the 1980s third world debt crisis, where there was massive protests in the streets around the developing world, backlash against the World Bank and Western banks. Imagine all that vitriol now primarily pointed towards China because of the massive loans that you can see in that graph and others over the last decade or so.
What was the incentive for China to embark on these loans in the first place, outpacing the World Bank and the IMF, according to your research? What part of their 5-year plan did this fall under?
I think a couple. One is the economic incentive. So, China, at a certain point, you've kind of built all the roads and high-speed rail and, apartments that you need domestically. And now all of these state connected firms in China are looking around like, what are we going to do now? Like, where are we going to drum up business? And so the Chinese government incentivized them to go abroad because there was obviously tremendous infrastructure need elsewhere. And China has the expertise and the wherewithal to just build lots of stuff. So they extended these loans to a lot of these developing countries so they could employ Chinese companies to build Chinese infrastructure, telecommunications networks in their country. And then the Chinese were hoping this will make us the primary player in those markets going forward. These countries will essentially be locked into our ecosystem of products and telecommunications networks and be dependent on our companies. Mm-hmm. And that means we'll have sustainable demand for Chinese goods, even as our population shrinks, and even if the Westerners all turn on us and slap us with tariffs. So I see the economic logic there. It's basically a massive stimulus package for Chinese industries to go build stuff abroad and make a bunch of money. And because the Chinese government has so much money in its banks, it could easily extend these loans on a short time frame. The other is just the geopolitical imperative. So China believes, I think quite rightly, it's in a very hostile world. It's very trade dependent. It imports a lot of its natural resources. And so having a bunch of partner nations around the world, especially those located around key choke points for international trade and shipping, and being able to control the ports there also may pay some dividends and help China diversify away from what are currently areas like the Strait of Malacca that are prowled by the US and allied navies that it has to worry would cut them off in a time of crisis.
So these emerging markets, not all of them are triple A rated in terms of their credit worthiness. What is their recourse if they default on their loans? Does China have a plan in place?
It seems like China right now is trying to kick the can down the road. So they've been extending a lot of short-term sort of rollover loans to help these countries pay the interest on their existing loans. I don't know what the long-term plan is, though, because the US and other countries have tried to get China to sit down in multilateral debt relief efforts. And I think the Chinese government has resisted, one, because they don't want to explain to the Chinese people why they sunk so much money in Kazakhstan or Laos or whatever instead of investing at home. But second, because a lot of these deals China crafted were pretty opaque and they like to keep it that way. And so if you're going to submit this to some kind of multilateral debt relief process, you're going to have to open up all of those books. So I don't know what what their long-term plan is here, because it doesn't seem like many of these countries will be able to pay back those loans anytime soon. And I don't think the Chinese want to get in the business of seizing assets and partner nations to try as collateral. So it will be really interesting to see how China plays this.
So final question, ultimately, how does your outlook for the Chinese economic growth picture impact the American economy in the medium term? By medium term, I mean for the next 4 years under Trump's presidency.
Yeah, I mean, compared to a world of like we all just trade together, it's obviously going to be slower growth. That said, I mean, the United States is one of the least trade dependent economies on the planet. Exports make up about 10% of GDP, and a third of that is with Mexico and Canada. And frankly, a lot of that is discretionary. I mean, the US could do more to be even less trade dependent than it already is. So I see it as a headwind for US growth, but not one that's going to fundamentally derail the American economic system. And I think in the medium term, there's actually benefits because the US is kind of realizing, hey, we probably overextended ourselves from a hyper globalization perspective. We didn't do enough to protect vulnerable communities in the US that were heavily reliant on concentrated manufacturing industries. We just outsourced them and let those communities get crushed. And we also made ourselves very vulnerable to potential adversaries. And so it's time to refocus our trade, reshore some of it, friendshore as much of it as possible, diversify it to other countries. So I see it in the long run as being a net positive from an economic security standpoint, even if the top line growth estimates will have to be shaved down a little bit just because like it doesn't pay to have trade wars between the two top economies.
One scenario we didn't discuss yet is the possibility of China just devaluing their currency. They also own a tremendous amount of treasuries, U.S. treasuries. They could dump those, potentially hurting the markets.
Yeah, this was kind of gamed out about a decade ago, and what the analysis suggests is that this would really hurt China a lot more because one, if you're gonna manipulate the value of your own currency, you're gonna have to let it float on international markets, and you give up a lot of control that you have domestically to tell the Chinese people what they can and can't do with their money. The other is that you just lose the value of the dollar will plummet initially, and so what is it, $2 trillion or something China has invested in those securities. The value of those will plummet. But then longer term, it's just going to cause a lot more protectionism and trade conflict, which may hurt the Chinese overall. So I know that this is probably 15 years ago now. Some Chinese hawks were pushing the regime to do exactly what you just said and dump those. And I remember Chinese diplomats immediately got up and said, "We will not be messing with those treasury securities," because they realize it's a double-edged sword for them. Yes, you can hurt the Americans, but you're going to be really stabbing yourself in the foot if you do that as well.
Is there any scenario in which you see China recovering to its former levels of growth?
No, but I think that's also because China's former levels of growth were so incredibly extraordinary.
Yeah.
That was the weird thing, to grow at 10% a year. No, almost no economy has achieved what China. I don't think any economy on the scale that China has. So it just makes sense that's not repeatable. But what I do worry about is that, can China get to sort of a 1% to 3% growth every year and just kind of have slow and steady growth? I think even that is frankly going to be very hard for China to do, because China, if you compare China to Japan, which had this lost decade, from the 1990s to the 2000s, basically by every metric, China's situation is worse. It's poorer on a per capita basis. Its debt is much bigger. It doesn't have the alliance and friendly relations with many other countries and Western countries to kind of help it ride out this situation. So I think China would do really well to just kind of settle into a 1% to 3% a year growth trajectory. Maybe that's possible, but if I had to bet, I would bet on the lower end of that.
Thank you very much, Michael. Great talk. Where can we learn more from you and read your work?
I have a website where I just try to post as many of my articles for free. It's just michaelbeckley.org, or if you just Google my name, Michael Beckley, it should be one of the first things that comes up. I don't do social media of any kind, so that's really the only way to see what I'm doing. And then one of my institutions, the American Enterprise Institute, also posts everything that I do on their website. So that would be another easy way to try to get past paywalls and just, kind of quickly go through everything that I've been writing.
Okay. So we'll put the links down below, michaelbeckley.org, and we'll put a link to your book as well. Should be an excellent read. Thank you very much, Michael. Happy New Year to you and your family, and we'll speak again soon. Thank you.
Thanks. Likewise, David.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.